What if the beginning of humanity was not a single moment, but a layered story you are still standing inside? What if the first chapter was never meant to be read cleanly, only felt? You start here not at a clear starting line, but at a question that hums quietly beneath everything you think you know. You picture the beginning the way textbooks often present it, a slow unfolding of bones and tools, fire-mastered language forming. That picture is real enough. What's broadly accepted is that human evolution followed a long, complex path shaped by environment, adaptation, and chance. Fossils, genetics, and archaeology all point to gradual change, not a sudden arrival. And yet, you notice how often people return to the same wondering thought. Why do so many cultures describe a time when knowledge appeared already formed? Why do early myths speak of teachers descending, arriving, or emerging with instructions? One interpretation is that these stories are symbolic, a way to compress generations of learning into something memorable. A careful reading might suggest that myth functions like memory under pressure, simplifying what was slow into something narratively useful. That explanation is reasonable. It keeps your feet on solid ground. Still, the question lingers. What if the story is pointing at something else? You are not here to prove anything tonight. You are here to listen, to separate what can be held firmly from what must remain light. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Most historians agree that Homo sapiens emerged in Africa and spread outward over tens of thousands of years. Archaeology suggests that early humans learned through observation, repetition, and social sharing. The evidence we do have points to intelligence developing gradually, shaped by survival needs rather than sudden intervention. Stone tools improve step by step. Fire use stabilizes slowly. Art appears in fragments, then grows richer. Nothing about this requires an outside hand. But here is where the quiet tension enters. Even within that gradual picture, there are moments that feel compressed, bursts of symbolic thinking, sudden consistency in tool styles across wide regions, rapid shifts in behaviour that appear faster than earlier patterns would predict. That does not mean anything extraordinary happened. A more cautious explanation could be that population growth, climate stability, or social density reached tipping points. Scholars continue to debate how quickly culture can accelerate once conditions allow. And yet a fringe idea proposes that ancient myths may preserve distorted memories of contact with a more advanced society. This theory is not widely accepted, but it persists because it taps into something deeply human. The sense that we did not do this alone. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less about aliens or lost empires, and more about how humans explain sudden change. You imagine early humans sitting near a fire, the smell of smoke, the rhythmic tap of stone on stone. Knowledge is passed hand to hand, not written down. A technique learned today might be remembered tomorrow or lost entirely. In that world, a particularly skilled group could feel almost supernatural. Teachers might be remembered as something more than human simply because they knew more. Historians still argue whether ancient myths should be read primarily as metaphor, social memory, or belief. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It reminds you that interpretation fills the gaps where evidence thins. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. A popular rumour claims that ancient civilizations existed long before recorded history, and that humans were shaped or instructed by them. Archaeology does not support the existence of a global, advanced civilization predating known cultures. What's broadly accepted is that complex societies leave durable traces, and those traces are absent. This raises an important point. Absence of evidence is not proof of secrecy, but it is a constraint. Any imagined scenario must remain small, fragile, and incomplete. So perhaps the idea does not require a lost super civilization. One interpretation is that small localized groups with unusual knowledge could have influenced others without leaving clear material footprints. This is suggestive, not conclusive. It raises the possibility that influence does not always scale with visibility. You feel the tone settle. This is not a story about hidden masters pulling strings. Never that. It is a story about how humans remember change, how instruction feels different from discovery, how learning from another can feel like creation itself. Before you go further, pause with me for just a moment. This channel grows because of quiet listeners like you. So before you begin this journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment sharing where you are listening from and what time it is there. These small human details help set the mood and remind us how wide this quiet circle really is. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move forward without crossing a clear threshold. The question stays beside you rather than ahead of you. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization is not a claim. It is a lens, a way of looking at familiar evidence from a slightly different angle. When you do that, the world does not change, but its edges soften. You think again of myths, of gods who teach farming, writing law, and medicine. Archaeology suggests that these skills emerge through long experimentation. The evidence we do have points to human agency at every step, and yet myth insists on teachers, on instruction arriving complete. A careful reading might suggest that this is how cultures honour their ancestors, by elevating them into something timeless. But what if the elevation hides something simpler? What if early humans encountered others who felt ancient even then? Not creators of biology, but accelerators of culture. This is debated. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is a narrative curiosity, not a historical conclusion. You keep walking, metaphorically speaking. The fire crackles again in your imagination. A tool is passed. Known becomes shared. Shared becomes tradition. Tradition becomes story. And story over time becomes origin. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. And for now, that is enough to carry you gently into the next stretch of the path. You continue without any sense of a new chapter opening. The ground beneath the story stays the same steady and familiar even as the view widens. You find yourself further back in time now, before cities, before writing, before anything that could easily explain itself later. What's broadly accepted is that early humans lived as small mobile groups, shaped by seasonal movement and immediate needs. Archaeology suggests that survival depended on flexibility, cooperation, and careful attention to land and animals. The evidence we do have points to lives that were intimate with place and rhythm rather than long-term planning. In this world, learning is personal. You learn by watching hands, not by reading symbols. A mistake costs time or safety. A success spreads because it works. Most historians agree that cultural knowledge moves slowly under these conditions, passing from one generation to the next through repetition and habit. There is no central authority, no archive, no guarantee that anything survives beyond memory. And yet, something subtle stands out when you look closely. Tool styles sometimes spread farther and faster than population movement alone would predict. Techniques appear in multiple regions with striking similarity. This does not require outside influence. A more cautious explanation could be that groups met more often than we assume, sharing ideas during migration overlaps. Climate corridors may have brought people together repeatedly, creating bursts of exchange. Still, one interpretation wonders whether certain groups functioned as hubs of knowledge, not rulers, not gods, just people who knew more, remembered more, or experimented more deliberately. In a largely oral world, that difference would feel enormous. Instruction could feel like transformation. Teaching could feel like creation. You imagine a small group arriving at a familiar campsite. Their tools are sharper, their methods more efficient. They hunt differently. They prepare food differently. They speak with confidence about patterns others only half understand. Archaeology suggests that innovation often begins locally like this. The evidence we do have points to uneven development, not uniform progress. But memory does strange things. A careful reading might suggest that when later generations retell these encounters, the distinction between skilled human and something greater begins to blur. Over time, storytellers compress details. They elevate the teacher. They smooth out the trial and error. What remains is a figure who arrives already knowing. Historians still argue whether early myths preserve real encounters or simply reflect how humans explain learning. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters more than any single answer. It leaves space for interpretation without forcing belief. A fringe idea proposes that an advanced human civilization existed alongside early hunter-gatherers and influenced them quietly. This theory is not widely accepted, largely because archaeology has not uncovered material evidence to support it. Stone tools, campsites, and genetic records show continuity rather than disruption. If such a group existed, it would have had to remain small, mobile, and materially modest. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it changes shape. It becomes less about lost cities and more about lost contexts, knowledge that did not fossilize, skills that left no durable mark, influence that travelled through people rather than objects. You notice how careful the ground must remain here. The solid facts do not disappear. Humans still adapt, still innovate, still drive their own story. The mystery does not replace that. It only asks whether acceleration sometimes came from contact rather than isolation. The fire returns as a quiet motif, smoke curling upward, someone demonstrating a technique with practiced ease, others watching closely. No ceremony, no announcement, just learning happening in real time. Later, much later, a descendant tells the story differently. Someone came, someone showed us. Someone changed things. What's broadly accepted is that myths often emerge from this exact process. Memory shaped by meaning. A careful reading might suggest that origin stories are less about literal beginnings and more about moments of importance. They mark when life changed direction. You keep the distinction clear. We are not claiming creation in a biological sense. Archaeology suggests that human anatomy developed long before complex culture. The evidence we do have points to evolution doing its work patiently. The question here is narrower and softer. What if humans were created culturally more than biologically, created as a way of speaking about being taught? That possibility does not rewrite history. It reframes it. It invites you to look at early humanity not as isolated sparks, but as a web of influence, uneven and fragile. Some threads hold, others vanish. A popular rumour claims that all early cultures share a single forgotten origin. This is debated and largely unsupported. Most historians agree that similarities can arise independently. Parallel invention is common when humans face similar problems. That explanation remains the strongest and safest footing. And yet, as you walk on, you allow yourself to hold one quiet question without urgency. What if some of those parallels were not parallel at all, but convergent memories of contact? We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues, and sometimes following clues simply means noticing where the silence is loudest. The night remains calm. The story continues without pause. You do not feel a shift so much as a tightening of focus. The story narrows, gently settling on something familiar and oddly intimate. Hands, tools, firelight reflecting off stone. What's broadly accepted is that early human technology developed slowly, shaped by repeated use and gradual refinement. Archaeology suggests that stone tools improved incrementally over hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence we do have points to patience rather than sudden genius. And yet within that slow curve, there are moments that seem to bend inward. Periods where innovation appears to cluster, techniques sharpen quickly, New methods spread with unusual speed. This does not break the mainstream picture. A more cautious explanation could be that environmental pressure demanded rapid adaptation. Climate shifts, resource scarcity, or population density can compress learning into shorter windows. Still, one interpretation lingers quietly. What if some of those leaps felt sudden because they were taught? You imagine a technique not discovered by accident but demonstrated. A better way to strike stone, a cleaner angle, a controlled use of fire that saves time and energy. To the learner, it feels like magic. To the teacher, it is simply experience. Archaeology suggests that skilled individuals often drive innovation. The evidence we do have points to uneven expertise within groups, not equal knowledge shared by all. But memory does not preserve skill evenly. A careful reading might suggest that when later generations retell how something began, the teacher becomes larger than life. The lesson becomes a gift rather than a process. Over time, instruction collapses into origin. Historians still argue whether technological leaps reflect social learning thresholds or exceptional individuals. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself reveals how fragile interpretation can be when material evidence thins. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient technologies appear too refined for their supposed age. This theory is not widely accepted, and in many cases, closer analysis shows gradual development after all. Stone tools, once thought sudden, often reveal intermediate forms when more sites are uncovered. This is suggestive of caution, not mystery. If we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, though, a softer question emerges. Not who made the tools, but how knowledge moved. Could there have been individuals or groups who specialised in teaching? Not rulers, not engineers, just carriers of technique. You feel the rhythm of repetition. Strike, adjust, strike again. Learning is embodied, not abstract. Someone who has practiced longer holds an advantage that looks effortless. To an observer, it can feel like the difference between before and after. What's broadly accepted is that early humans learned primarily through imitation. Archaeology suggests that watching and copying were central to survival. The evidence we do have points to apprenticeship-like relationships long before formal education existed. But myths remember differently. Myths prefer moments. A careful reading might suggest that stories compress long learning arcs into singular encounters. Someone arrived. Someone showed us. Suddenly things changed. You let that thought sit without grabbing it too tightly. A popular rumour claims that fire itself was a gift from an external source. Most historians agree this is symbolic, reflecting the importance of fire rather than its origin. Controlled fire use appears gradually in the archaeological record. The solid ground holds. Still fire remains a powerful image. It marks the difference between raw and prepared, between cold and warmth, between night and safety. If someone taught you to control it better, you might remember them forever. You move forward, still calm, still grounded. The question does not demand belief. It only invites attention. What if creation stories are not about making bodies but shaping behaviour? Not about engineering flesh, but accelerating learning. That idea stays within the bounds of possibility. It does not challenge evolution, it reframes culture. And culture, as you know, can change everything without leaving a fossil. The fire crackles again in your imagination. Stone warms in your hand. Knowledge passes quietly, one demonstration at a time. And somewhere far ahead, someone will tell the story differently. You drift onward, and the focus loosens, again widening into voices rather than hands. The sound of speech, repeated and reshaped, settles into the centre of the story. What's broadly accepted is that long before writing, humans relied entirely on oral tradition to preserve knowledge. Archaeology suggests that memory, repetition and performance were the primary tools for carrying information across generations. The evidence we do have points to storytelling as a survival mechanism, not entertainment. In a world without records, stories do heavy lifting. They explain where to hunt, when to move, which plants heal and which harm. They encode warnings. They hold social rules. Most historians agree that oral cultures developed sophisticated ways to remember complex information accurately over long periods. Rhythm, repetition, and vivid imagery are not decoration, they are technology. And yet stories also change, not randomly, but meaningfully. A careful reading might suggest that the more important a lesson feels, the more likely it is to be preserved through memorable figures rather than abstract advice. Instead of saying, "This technique took many seasons to refine," a story says someone came and showed us. The information survives. The process disappears. You imagine sitting close to others as night settles in. Firelight flickers across faces. A familiar voice begins again. The beginning is always the same. The ending drifts slightly. No one notices. No one corrects it. What matters is that the lesson still works. Historians still argue whether oral traditions can preserve real historical events over thousands of years. There's no full consensus. Some examples suggest remarkable accuracy. Others show dramatic transformation. Both can be true at once. Memory preserves meaning better than detail. One interpretation is that early stories about creators and teachers reflect this compression. Not beings who made humans from nothing but figures who introduced order, skill, or structure. A careful reading might suggest that creation in these stories means becoming fully human rather than biologically human. Archaeology suggests that symbolic thinking expanded dramatically during the Upper Paleolithic period. The evidence we do have points to art, ritual, and narrative becoming central to identity. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and burial practices all appear with increasing complexity. These are not survival tools in a narrow sense, they are social tools. Still, the timing raises quiet questions. Why does symbolic behaviour cluster when it does? Why does it spread so widely? A more cautious explanation could be that population density reached a threshold where shared meaning became essential. When groups grow larger, stories help maintain cohesion. But one interpretation lingers alongside that. What if certain narratives spread because they were attached to specific teachers? Stories about beings who arrive with knowledge might preserve the memory of influential individuals whose impact felt transformative. A fringe idea proposes that ancient storytellers encoded real encounters with advanced visitors into mythic language. This theory is not widely accepted, and it faces serious challenges. Oral traditions are shaped by cultural needs, not historical accuracy. The solid ground remains that humans are fully capable of creating powerful myths without external input. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, the idea softens. It no longer claims literal visitors crafting humanity. It asks whether exceptional teachers could have been remembered as something more than human because of what they changed. You notice how often myths emphasize instruction. Not just creation, but teaching. Farming taught, laws taught, medicine taught, music taught, writing taught. What's broadly accepted is that these skills developed gradually in different places. Archaeology suggests no single source. The evidence we do have points to independent invention. And yet the stories persist. A careful reading might suggest that cultures use teaching figures to anchor gratitude. Someone helped us survive. Someone helped us understand. That someone becomes sacred not because they were supernatural, but because they mattered. A popular rumour claims that all ancient myths describe the same lost teachers under different names. Most historians agree this is an oversimplification. Similarities across myths can arise from shared human experience. Birth, death, seasons, fear, hope. These repeat everywhere. Still, the repetition itself is worth noticing. You are not concluding anything. You are observing patterns. The story does not insist. It invites. You feel the pace slow slightly. Stories do that. They stretch time. They allow reflection without demand. The fire burns lower. The voice softens. What if the question of creation is really a question of memory? What if humans were not made by an ancient civilization, but remembered into significance by those who taught them how to live differently? That possibility stays safely within the mist. It does not overwrite archaeology. It does not deny evolution. It simply reframes myth as a lens rather than a ledger. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep them separate even as they brush against each other. You carry the sound of the story forward with you, not as proof, as atmosphere, as a reminder that how humans tell their beginnings says as much about their fears and hopes as it does about their past. And the night remains calm. You move forward, and the landscape subtly changes again, becoming wider and more settled. The motion of constant travel gives way to staying in one place long enough to reshape it. What's broadly accepted is that agriculture emerged independently in several regions of the world, driven by environmental pressures and long experimentation. Archaeology suggests that early farming developed slowly, with many false starts, abandoned fields, and mixed strategies. The evidence we do have points to patience rather than planning. For generations, people gathered wild grains, tended patches casually, and learned what worked by failing repeatedly. Domestication was not a moment. It was a process measured in centuries. Most historians agree that no single culture invented agriculture fully formed. It crept forward through observation, selective planting, and seasonal memory. And yet, when you listen to the stories cultures tell about this shift, they sound very different. Fields appear suddenly. Seeds are gifts. Knowledge arrives already organised. One interpretation is that myth compresses long transitions into moments of clarity. A careful reading might suggest that farming myths function as gratitude narratives, honouring the importance of a change too large to explain casually. You imagine the first time someone shows another how to plant deliberately rather than scatter, how to store grain, how to plan beyond the next hunt. Archaeology suggests that such knowledge spread unevenly. The evidence we do have points to regional teaching, not universal discovery. Still, the emotional weight of that teaching matters. Learning to farm does not just change diet, it reshapes time itself. Seasons become schedules. Land becomes property. Future hunger becomes something you can imagine and prepare for. To those who learned it second-hand, instruction could feel like creation. You were one kind of human before. You are another afterward. Historians still argue whether agriculture was embraced willingly or adopted under pressure. There's no full consensus. Some evidence suggests people resisted farming at first, preferring mobility and dietary diversity. Others point to population growth forcing the change. Both can be true depending on place and time. A fringe idea proposes that agriculture spread so quickly because it was taught by a more advanced group. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology shows clear local domestication processes. Wild plant ancestors are found near early farming sites. The solid ground remains firm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, the idea shifts again. Not advanced outsiders, but early specialists. People who focused on plants while others focused on hunting. Teachers remembered because they altered survival itself. You notice how myths describe these figures. They are not conquerors. They are instructors. They show. They warn. They demonstrate. A careful reading might suggest that creation language is being used to describe cultural rebirth rather than biological origin. What's broadly accepted is that farming knowledge required coordination and trust. Archaeology suggests that early villages formed social rules alongside crops. The evidence we do have points to cooperation as essential. Teaching someone to farm is teaching them to stay. A popular rumour claims that ancient gods genetically engineered crops and humans together. Most historians agree this is symbolic storytelling. Domestication leaves genetic traces that show gradual selection, not sudden design. That distinction matters. But symbolism does not mean emptiness. Stories carry emotional truth even when they do not carry technical detail. You feel the shift from wandering to settling, from reacting to planning, from nature as partner to nature as system. You let the question rest lightly. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization is still not a statement. It is a metaphor that keeps changing shape. Here it feels less like invention and more like instruction, less like making bodies and more like teaching patience. The fields settle into your imagination. Wind moves through grass. Someone kneels and presses seeds into soil with practiced calm. Others watch. Later they tell the story differently. The night continues. The pace remains gentle. Nothing needs to be decided yet. You move onward, and the sky quietly enters the story. Not as myth yet, but as measurement. What's broadly accepted is that ancient people paid close attention to the movement of the sun, moon and stars. Archaeology suggests that early monuments, stone circles and marked landscapes often align with solstices, equinoxes and lunar cycles. The evidence we do have points to careful observation built up over many generations. Watching the sky does not require advanced tools. It requires patience. You notice patterns by returning night after night. You remember where the sun rises, where it sets, how shadows shorten and stretch. Most historians agree that this kind of knowledge develops slowly and communally. No single observer owns it. It belongs to the group. And yet some constructions feel deliberate in a way that invites pause. Stones placed with precision, sightlines held steady across centuries. One interpretation is that these alignments reflect ritual importance. A careful reading might suggest that marking time helped communities coordinate planting movement and ceremony. That explanation is practical and grounded. Still, you sense how easily such knowledge could feel extraordinary to those who did not witness its accumulation. Imagine someone who understands the cycle deeply, who knows when light will return, when darkness will peak, when the year will turn. To others, that person appears to command the sky. Historians still argue whether astronomical knowledge spread independently or through cultural exchange. There's no full consensus. Some alignments appear in places far apart with no clear contact. Others cluster along known trade routes. Both patterns likely exist. A fringe idea proposes that advanced astronomical knowledge was gifted to early humans by an ancient civilization. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology shows that sky watching does not require advanced mathematics to begin. The solid ground remains that humans are capable of careful, long-term observation without outside instruction. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, another version appears. What if certain groups specialised in sky knowledge and travelled? Not masters of technology, but keepers of calendars, teachers of timing, people whose value came from knowing when. You imagine someone arriving with confidence, saying not today, but soon. Not now, but after the light shifts. That certainty changes behaviour. It builds trust. It shapes memory. A careful reading might suggest that sky teachers become sky gods, not because they came from above, but because their knowledge did. What's broadly accepted is that aligning structures to the sky reinforces social cohesion. Archaeology suggests that shared rituals strengthen group identity. The evidence we do have points to monuments as social anchors more than scientific observatories. But memory again does its work. Stories simplify. They lift explanation into symbol. Someone who marked time becomes someone who controlled it. A popular rumour claims that ancient monuments prove lost advanced science. Most historians agree that this overstates the case. Many impressive alignments can be achieved with simple tools and long observation. That distinction matters. Still, the feeling remains. Standing stones under stars carry weight. They invite wonder without demanding belief. You let the night sky settle over the story. The question continues to soften. Creation here feels less like invention and more like orientation, teaching people how to stand in time as well as space. You move on calm and unhurried. You keep moving, and the view widens again, this time into clusters of people who no longer drift apart after meeting. Paths cross often enough to become routes. Camps return often enough to feel like places. What's broadly accepted is that early societies began forming larger, more stable communities as resources and knowledge accumulated. Archaeology suggests that this shift did not happen all at once and not everywhere in the same way. The evidence we do have points to many small experiments rather than one shared blueprint. These early communities are not cities yet. They are gatherings with memory. People begin to recognise strangers from past seasons. Agreements last longer than a single hunt. Skills specialise. Someone knaps stone. Someone tracks animals. Someone watches the sky. Someone remembers stories accurately. Most historians agree that specialisation emerges naturally when groups grow large enough to support it. And specialisation changes how influence works. Knowledge is no longer evenly distributed. Some people become relied upon in ways that feel essential. One interpretation is that authority begins here, not as domination but as dependence. A careful reading might suggest that power in early societies flows toward those who reduce uncertainty. You imagine a meeting between groups. Goods are exchanged. Techniques are demonstrated. Stories are shared. Archaeology suggests that long-distance contact existed earlier than once assumed. The evidence we do have points to shells, pigments, and stone travelling far beyond their sources. Ideas travel even farther. Still, the pattern raises gentle questions. Why do certain concepts appear in multiple places around the same time? Why do settlement layouts, ritual spaces, and symbolic motifs sometimes echo across regions? A more cautious explanation could be parallel development. Similar problems produce similar solutions. Humans are good at converging. But one interpretation wonders if shared inspiration played a role. Not a single guiding hand, but a network of exchange denser than we usually imagine. Teachers meeting teachers, specialists comparing methods. Over time, memory simplifies the network into a source. Historians still argue whether early cultural similarities reflect contact or coincidence. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself reminds you how thin the line is between influence and independence. A fringe idea proposes that an advanced ancient civilization served as a cultural seed, inspiring multiple societies. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology does not support a centralised source of early culture. Sites show local variation, not uniform design. The solid ground holds. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, the idea shifts again. What if influence moved through people rather than places? What if certain individuals travelled widely, sharing practices that felt transformative wherever they went? Over generations, their impact could be remembered as origin rather than contact. You notice how myths often describe civilizing figures who wander. They arrive, they teach, they leave. The pattern repeats across cultures. A careful reading might suggest this reflects real social roles. Itinerant specialists, mediators, knowledge carriers in a world without institutions. What's broadly accepted is that trade networks foster cultural exchange. Archaeology suggests that ideas spread along the same paths as goods. The evidence we do have points to interaction as a driver of complexity. But memory again reshapes scale. Networks become lineages. Lineages become founders. Founders become creators. You picture a tool passed across a fire, a planting method shared during a seasonal gathering, a calendar adjusted after conversation. None of this requires a hidden civilization. It requires humans meeting and remembering selectively. A popular rumour claims that ancient societies shared a lost global language or code. Most historians agree this is unlikely. Language evolves quickly, and divergence appears early in the record. That matters. Still, shared gestures remain, shared symbols, shared stories of being shown how to live. You let those patterns sit without forcing them into alignment. Creation here continues to feel less literal and more relational. Humans created as members of a wider web, defined not by isolation but by connection. The night stays steady. The story moves on. You continue without pause, and the texture of the world subtly changes again. Sound becomes more precise. Memory becomes more deliberate. Marks begin to matter. What's broadly accepted is that writing emerged independently in several regions as societies grew more complex. Archaeology suggests that early writing systems developed from practical needs like accounting administration and ritual record keeping. The evidence we do have points to symbols evolving gradually from pictures into abstract signs. At first, marks are reminders, not language. Tallies scratched into bone, symbols pressed into clay. They do not tell stories yet. They keep track. Most historians agree that writing was not invented to preserve poetry or myth. It was invented to manage resources, obligations, and time. And yet once writing exists, everything changes. Knowledge can outlive the person who holds it. Instruction can travel without the teacher. One interpretation is that writing feels like a kind of creation because it extends memory beyond the body. A careful reading might suggest that the shock of this shift echoes through later stories. You imagine someone watching symbols pressed into wet clay for the first time. Information no longer needs to be remembered perfectly. It can be stored, revisited, corrected. That moment does not require an outside civilization. Archaeology shows clear steps leading toward writing. The solid ground holds. Still, the emotional impact of writing is difficult to overstate. To those encountering it early, it might feel like knowledge arriving whole. A list becomes law. A mark becomes authority. Someone who controls writing controls continuity. Historians still argue whether writing spread primarily through trade conquest or imitation. There's no full consensus. Some scripts appear tightly localized, others spread rapidly. Both patterns exist depending on context. A fringe idea proposes that writing was a gift from an ancient advanced culture passed down as a complete system. This theory is not widely accepted. Linguistic analysis shows clear developmental stages in scripts. Symbols shift shape, sounds change, errors appear. These are signs of human invention. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though a subtler idea emerges. What if early writing was taught by a small number of specialists who moved between communities? Not creators of language, but accelerators of literacy, teachers whose influence outpaced their visibility. You notice how myths describe writing as divine, tablets from the gods, words taught by higher beings. A careful reading might suggest that this language reflects awe rather than origin. Writing feels unnatural at first. It breaks the rules of forgetting. What's broadly accepted is that literacy changes social structure. Archaeology suggests that early literate societies develop hierarchies faster. The evidence we do have points to record keepers gaining power simply by remembering better than others. But memory again reshapes the past. Over generations, the first scribes are no longer people. They become figures. Figures become founders. Founders become creators. A popular rumour claims that ancient texts hide advanced technical knowledge far beyond their time. Most historians agree that while some texts are impressive, they reflect the knowledge of their era rather than lost science. Interpretation matters. Still, writing introduces something new into the question of creation. If knowledge can be preserved intact, then teaching no longer depends on presence. Humans are shaped by instructions written long before they are born. You feel the question deepen rather than sharpen. What if creation is not a single act, but an accumulation of instruction layered over generations? Writing makes that layering visible. The clay tablet cools. The marks harden. Someone walks away, unaware of how long those marks will last. The story moves on, quiet and steady. You continue, and authority enters the story without announcing itself. not as force at first, but as explanation. Someone speaks, and others listen, because the words organise uncertainty. What's broadly accepted is that early leadership often emerged from social roles tied to coordination ritual or conflict resolution. Archaeology suggests that the earliest rulers were not kings in the later sense, but figures whose influence rested on tradition, charisma, or specialised knowledge. The evidence we do have points to leadership growing out of function rather than domination. As communities settle and grow, decisions begin to echo longer. Planting choices affect next year. Alliances affect survival. Memory becomes political. Most historians agree that early authority relied heavily on narrative. Leaders justified their role by explaining why order mattered and how it connected to forces larger than any one person. You notice how quickly explanation turns upward. Leaders speak for ancestors, for spirits, for the land. One interpretation is that divine language offered stability. A careful reading might suggest that when rules are framed as sacred, they last longer than when they are framed as preference. Archaeology suggests that early monuments and ritual spaces often cluster around leadership centres. The evidence we do have points to belief and governance intertwining early. This does not require deception. Shared belief can genuinely bind people together. Still, the language of origin persists. Kings claim descent from gods. Lawgivers receive rules from higher beings. One interpretation is that these claims reflect memory of instruction. If leadership began as teaching later, leaders may have inherited the language without the context. Historians still argue whether divine kingship reflects political strategy or sincere belief. There's no full consensus. In some societies, rulers clearly manipulated myth. In others, they appear bound by it. Both patterns appear in the record. A fringe idea proposes that early rulers preserved knowledge passed down from an ancient civilization and used it to legitimize power. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology shows that early states developed gradually with clear local roots. The solid ground remains that power grows where resources and coordination concentrate. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though a quieter idea forms. What if early authority felt sacred because it rested on inherited instruction? Not secrets of technology, but knowledge of cycles, law, and coordination that others did not yet possess. You imagine a leader explaining why fields must be planted this way, why rituals happen on this day, why disputes are settled through this process. To followers, this can feel like order arriving from beyond. Over time, explanation hardens into origin story. What's broadly accepted is that myth often serves governance. Archaeology suggests that shared stories reinforce social rules. The evidence we do have points to belief as a stabilizing force. But belief also remembers selectively. The teacher becomes the ancestor becomes the god becomes the creator. A popular rumour claims that ancient kings were literally engineered or appointed by advanced beings. Most historians agree this is symbolic language rather than historical record. Genealogies reflect social aspiration as much as lineage. That distinction matters. Still, you notice how often leadership myths emphasize teaching rather than conquest. Laws given, wisdom received, order introduced, creation described not as making people, but making society. The question remains soft. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization is still not about bodies? Here it feels like governance, humans becoming subjects of law rather than just members of a group. You move on carrying that thought lightly. You continue, and the texture of the story becomes more symbolic, less anchored to a single place. Knowledge now travels as narrative rather than demonstration. What's broadly accepted is that myths arise as societies attempt to explain origins, values, and sudden changes they can no longer trace directly. Archaeology suggests that myths often preserve emotional truth rather than technical detail. The evidence we do have points to stories as tools for meaning, not records, in the modern sense. Across cultures, you notice a recurring theme. Knowledge arrives suddenly. A figure appears and brings law-writing, farming, medicine, or ritual. The people are changed afterward. One interpretation is that myth compresses centuries of learning into a single moment to make it memorable. A careful reading might suggest that these stories mark thresholds rather than events. You imagine listening to such a story long after its origin. The teller was not there. The teller learned it from someone else. Over time, the story sheds its slow parts. Trial and error vanish. What remains is arrival. Teaching becomes gift. Instruction becomes creation. Most historians agree that mythic figures often represent collective processes rather than individuals. Flood heroes may reflect repeated disasters. Culture heroes may reflect gradual innovation. This keeps you on solid ground. Humans are capable of myth-making without external input. Still, you notice how specific some myths are. Not just that knowledge was given, but how. Measurements, rules, sequences, warnings. A more cautious explanation could be that these details emerged from long practice and were later framed as revealed wisdom. Historians still argue whether myth preserves fragments of real encounters or purely symbolic structures. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself highlights how difficult it is to separate memory from meaning once writing is absent. A fringe idea proposes that myths encode encounters with an ancient advanced civilization that shaped early human development. This theory is not widely accepted, largely because myths change too freely to serve as reliable evidence. Archaeology does not support sudden external intervention. The solid ground remains firm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, the idea changes tone. It becomes less about literal visitors and more about remembered disruption. Something changed fast enough that later generations struggled to explain it using ordinary cause and effect. You think about how humans respond to sudden improvement. When a method works far better than expected, it feels gifted. When order replaces chaos, it feels intentional. Creation language may emerge not because bodies were made, but because lives were reorganized. What's broadly accepted is that humans attribute agency to change. Archaeology suggests that when societies undergo rapid transformation, they explain it through stories of intervention. The evidence we do have points to narrative as a stabilizer during uncertainty. A popular rumour claims that ancient myths all describe the same creators under different names. Most historians agree this oversimplifies cultural diversity. Similar themes can arise independently because humans face similar challenges. That distinction matters. Still, similarity does not require identity to be interesting. You allow yourself to notice patterns without forcing them together. Arrival, teaching, departure, memory. The question stays gentle. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization is still not a claim. Here it feels like a way to ask why humans describe knowledge as something that comes from elsewhere, rather than something that grows slowly from within. You let the thought drift. Myths are not answers. They are mirrors. And tonight you are simply watching the reflection. You move forward and the story becomes less grounded in soil and sky and more entangled with imagination. The past begins to stretch in unfamiliar directions. Maps appear not just of land, but of belief. What's broadly accepted is that ancient maps often blended observation with symbolism. Archaeology suggests that early cartography was as much about meaning as accuracy. The evidence we do have points to maps functioning as cultural statements rather than precise measurements. Some ancient maps place familiar rivers beside impossible lands. Mountains stretch too far. Seas curve strangely. Creatures appear where knowledge thins. Most historians agree that this was not confusion, but intention. Maps were tools for orientation in a world that felt vast and unpredictable. And yet, certain details invite quiet curiosity. Some maps preserve coastlines that seem oddly familiar. Others include lands no longer accessible. A more cautious explanation could be that these reflect travellers' tales distorted through retelling. Memory stretches space the way myth stretches time. You imagine someone drawing what they have never seen, guided by description alone. The result is not false, it is interpretive. A careful reading might suggest that ancient maps tell us more about how people understood their place in the world than about geography itself. Still, a fringe idea proposes that ancient maps preserve fragments of lost global knowledge passed down from an earlier civilization. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology does not support the existence of precise global mapping technology in deep antiquity. The solid ground remains firm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though another interpretation emerges. What if maps record inherited expectations? Not actual continents, but remembered connections. Knowledge of far places reduced to symbol after contact faded. Historians still argue whether ancient maps reflect exploration imagination or cultural memory. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty mirrors the larger question you are carrying. How much of the past is forgotten experience reshaped into story? You notice how often ancient cultures imagined a time before time, a golden age, an earlier world where knowledge was complete and loss had not yet occurred. What's broadly accepted is that these stories emerge during periods of change or decline. Archaeology suggests that nostalgia often follows disruption. The evidence we do have points to memory idealizing what came before. Creation myths sometimes describe not the beginning of humanity, but the end of something better. Humans are said to be made after gods withdraw, after order fractures, after knowledge diminishes. A careful reading might suggest that creation here is actually a downgrade, not an upgrade. This inversion matters. It reframes the idea of humans being created by an ancient civilization as a story about loss rather than design. If an earlier group existed that felt wiser, calmer, or more ordered, later generations might remember themselves as lesser by comparison. You let that idea rest gently. It does not require advanced technology. It requires only difference. A group that lived differently enough to feel unreachable afterward. A popular rumour claims that ancient texts describe precise measurements and technologies far beyond their time. Most historians agree that while some descriptions are impressive, they often reflect metaphor or later interpretation. Precision in myth is not the same as precision in practice. Still, numbers carry weight. Measurements suggest order. Order suggests intention. Intention suggests design. Creation language follows naturally. What's broadly accepted is that humans are pattern-seeking. Archaeology suggests that when evidence fragments the mind, fills gaps with coherence. The evidence we do have points to imagination as a stabilizing force, not a flaw. You think about how easily memory reshapes scale. 100 years becomes a moment. A group becomes a being. A process becomes an act. Creation emerges not from engineering, but from compression. The maps in your mind blur slightly, edges soften. The point is not where they lead, but why they were drawn. To say we came from somewhere. To say we were shown. To say we were not alone at the beginning. That idea remains unresolved, and that is important. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues, and sometimes the clue is simply how often the same longing appears. You move on, still calm, still grounded, carrying the sense that creation stories may be less about origins and more about orientation. Humans asking where they belong after forgetting where they came from. The night remains steady. The path continues. You continue without noticing a sharp boundary, and the figures in the story begin to grow taller, heavier, more exaggerated. Not in body, but in memory. Giants appear. Watchers. Culture heroes whose scale feels larger than ordinary life. What's broadly accepted is that many ancient societies described legendary beings who stood between gods and humans. Archaeology suggests these figures often emerge in periods when societies are reorganizing themselves. The evidence we do have points to myth responding to social change rather than recording literal beings. You notice how these figures are described. They do not simply rule, they teach. They show humans how to build, how to measure, how to divide land, how to read the sky. One interpretation is that size in myth represents importance rather than physical height. A careful reading might suggest that calling someone a giant is a way of saying their influence was enormous. Historians still argue whether legendary teachers reflect real individuals, elevated over time, or purely symbolic creations. There's no full consensus. Some myths appear to layer multiple generations into one name. Others seem to preserve specific roles exaggerated through retelling. A fringe idea proposes that these giants or watchers were members of an ancient advanced civilization that guided early humans. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology does not support the existence of non-human beings walking openly among early societies. Skeletal remains show normal human variation, not a separate class of giants. The solid ground remains intact. If we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, however, another explanation surfaces. What if these stories remember human teachers whose knowledge made them feel otherworldly? In small communities, even modest advantages can appear miraculous. Someone who understands engineering, astronomy, or medicine beyond local norms might be remembered as something more than human. You imagine a figure arriving with tools unfamiliar to the group. Not impossible tools, just better ones. Sharper stone, more reliable methods, clear rules. Over generations, the memory of difference expands. The teacher becomes taller, their voice louder, their lifespan longer. Myth does not invent, it amplifies. What's broadly accepted is that oral tradition increases exaggeration over time, especially when stories serve identity. Archaeology suggests that legendary figures often coincide with the introduction of new social structures. The evidence we do have points to myth crystallizing around change agents. You notice how watchers are often described as intermediaries. They stand between heaven and earth, between old ways and new. A careful reading might suggest that heaven here symbolizes abstract knowledge rather than literal sky beings. The watcher watches because they observe patterns others miss. A popular rumour claims that watcher myths describe literal non-human overseers. Most historians agree this is a later interpretation shaped by modern imagination. Ancient texts themselves are often poetic, not technical. That distinction matters. Still, the persistence of the watcher role is striking. Cultures separated by distance imagine beings who teach and then withdraw. The departure is as important as the arrival. Knowledge remains. The teachers do not. You feel the emotional logic of that. When a group changes quickly, it can feel as though something left along with the uncertainty. The past becomes heavier. The present feels diminished. Creation stories flip. Humans are no longer rising. They are falling away from something better. What's broadly accepted is that myths often express anxiety about decline. Archaeology suggests that Golden Age narratives follow periods of instability. The evidence we do have points to memory smoothing hardship by imagining a better before. So the idea that humans were created by an ancient civilization begins to look less like science fiction and more like grief. A way of saying we used to know more, we used to be guided, we used to be closer to understanding. This is debated. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is one way humans have explained the feeling of having inherited a world without instructions. You keep the solid ground beneath you. Humans evolve. Humans build. Humans adapt. But they also remember selectively. And sometimes they remember teachers as creators because teaching feels like transformation. The giants shrink slightly as you move on, not because they vanish, but because their outline becomes clearer. They were not above humanity. They were part of it magnified by memory. The night stays calm. The story continues to breathe. You move on, and the ground beneath the story subtly narrows again, focusing not on myth or monument, but on bodies themselves. Not bodies as symbols, but bodies as evidence. What's broadly accepted is that human populations experience several genetic bottlenecks in deep prehistory. Archaeology suggests these bottlenecks were caused by climate shifts, migrations, disease, or ecological pressure. The evidence we do have points to survival through reduction rather than abundance. A bottleneck is not extinction, it is narrowing. Fewer people carrying forward the future. Traits concentrate. Variation tightens. Most historians agree that these moments shaped humanity profoundly, influencing not just biology but culture. When groups shrink, knowledge becomes fragile. Skills can vanish in a generation. And yet myths often describe these same periods as moments of creation. After a flood, after fire, after darkness, humans are remade. One interpretation is that creation language emerges when continuity breaks. A careful reading might suggest that when the chain of teaching snaps, rebuilding feels like starting over. You imagine a small group emerging from catastrophe. Fewer elders, fewer specialists. Much of what once existed is gone. Archaeology suggests that after such disruptions, societies simplify before they complexify again. The evidence we do have points to cultural reset rather than collapse. But memory rarely frames it that way. Memory prefers meaning over mechanics. Survivors tell stories, not of loss but of renewal. Someone teaches again. Order returns. Humans are described as being made anew. Historians still argue whether certain myths reflect real population crashes or symbolic moral lessons. There's no full consensus. Some narratives align loosely with known climate events. Others appear timeless. Both can coexist without confirming each other. A fringe idea proposes that genetic bottlenecks reflect deliberate intervention by an ancient civilization shaping humanity. This theory is not widely accepted. Genetic data shows patterns consistent with natural population dynamics. The solid ground remains firm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, another interpretation arises. What if bottlenecks magnified the influence of a few teachers? When only a small number of people survive, those who know how to rebuild shape everything that follows, culture becomes concentrated as much as genes. You imagine instruction carrying enormous weight in such moments. How to make tools again, how to track seasons, how to choose safe food. To those receiving it, teaching feels like life itself. Creation language does not feel exaggerated. It feels accurate in an emotional sense. What's broadly accepted is that humans learn socially. Archaeology suggests that cultural transmission can be more vulnerable than biology during crisis. The evidence we do have points to knowledge loss happening faster than genetic loss. Myths of creation after catastrophe may reflect this reality. Humans were not biologically remade. They were culturally reassembled. A careful reading might suggest that gods creating humans from clay or breath symbolize rebuilding from minimal resources. A popular rumour claims that genetic anomalies point to external engineering. Most historians agree that observed genetic patterns fall within known evolutionary processes. Mutation selection drift. These mechanisms explain the data without invoking design. That distinction matters. Still, the emotional resonance remains. Narrow survival funnels create powerful ancestors. A few people stand at the beginning of many lineages. Over time, their role expands in memory. They are no longer survivors. They are creators. You feel the story slowing slightly here. This is delicate ground. The line between evidence and imagination must remain clear. Humans are shaped by natural forces. That is documented. But how humans remember survival is interpretive. The question continues to shift. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization becomes less about origin and more about recovery, less about invention and more about instruction after loss? You let that idea sit quietly. No urgency, no claim, just a lens. The night remains steady. The path continues forward, carrying both what we know and what we wonder. You continue, and the air around the story feels heavier, not with fear, but with aftermath. This is the space after disruption, when the world still exists but must be interpreted again. What's broadly accepted is that natural disasters have repeatedly reshaped human societies. Archaeology suggests that floods, droughts, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes cause sudden population movements and cultural breaks. The evidence we do have points to recovery happening unevenly, with some knowledge preserved and some lost. When disaster strikes, survival becomes immediate. Long-term systems fracture. Specialised roles disappear. Most historians agree that complex knowledge is fragile in these moments. Skills that require training and continuity often vanish first. What remains are essentials. And yet, when stability returns, societies rarely rebuild exactly as before. One interpretation is that post-disaster cultures reconstruct themselves using fragments of memory. A careful reading might suggest that what survives is not always what mattered most, but what could be carried by the few who remained. You imagine a group settling again after chaos. They know that something was lost, but not precisely what. Stories fill the gaps. Someone remembers that things were once better organised. Someone recalls rules that no longer quite fit. Teaching resumes, but it feels incomplete. Historians still argue whether certain ancient flood or fire myths reflect real events or purely symbolic cycles. There's no full consensus. Some narratives loosely align with geological evidence, others do not. Both can coexist without confirming each other. A fringe idea proposes that disasters erased evidence of an advanced ancient civilization that once guided humanity. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology shows continuity across disasters rather than total erasure. Large-scale societies leave resilient traces. The solid ground holds. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. However, the idea becomes quieter. Not a vanished global civilization, but localized centers of knowledge lost to sudden change. A handful of specialists gone. A method forgotten. The gap feels enormous to those left behind. You notice how myths often describe knowledge returning after catastrophe through a single figure. Someone survives. Someone remembers. Someone teaches again. Creation follows destruction. A careful reading might suggest that these figures represent continuity rather than invention. What's broadly accepted is that rebuilding requires coordination and shared meaning. Archaeology suggests that rituals and stories become especially important after disruption. The evidence we do have points to myth as a stabilizer during uncertainty, but memory again reshapes scale. A teacher who helps rebuild becomes the one who remade the world. Instructions become commandments. Adaptation becomes creation. A popular rumour claims that ancient catastrophes wiped out nearly all human knowledge and forced humanity to start from nothing. Most historians agree this overstates the case. While disasters are devastating, humans tend to preserve at least some cultural continuity. That matters. Still, the feeling of starting over is powerful. When enough familiar structures disappear, the world feels new even if it is not. Creation language emerges naturally in that space. You let the question rest gently. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization now feels less like design and more like inheritance interrupted, a sense that something once existed and was only partially passed on? The story does not rush here. Recovery takes time, memory drifts, instruction resumes slowly, and in that slow rebuilding myths take root. The night stays calm, the path continues. You continue and the story grows quieter, more careful, as if it knows it is approaching the edge of what can be demonstrated. This is the place where absence matters as much as presence. What's broadly accepted is that archaeology preserves only a fraction of past human activity. Organic materials decay, wood rots, textiles vanish, even stone erodes given enough time. The evidence we do have points to survival of the durable, not the typical. Most historians agree that what we recover from the past is biased toward what lasts rather than what mattered most. Everyday teaching leaves fewer traces than monuments. Conversation leaves none at all. A careful reading might suggest that the absence of evidence often reflects the fragility of transmission rather than the absence of influence. You imagine how much learning happens without leaving marks, a hand guiding another hand, a correction offered quietly, a rule explained once and never written down. Archaeology suggests that most knowledge moved this way for most of human history. The solid ground here is firm. Humans taught each other constantly, and most of that teaching vanished without record. And yet absence invites speculation. When we do not find expected traces, questions emerge. Why is something missing? Why does a technique appear without a clear trail? Why does a story exist without a corresponding artifact? A more cautious explanation could be preservation bias. Some materials simply do not survive. Still, one interpretation wonders whether some knowledge was intentionally limited in its physical footprint, not hidden in the dramatic sense, but practiced in ways that did not generate durable remains. Teaching can be ephemeral by nature. It leaves changed people, not changed landscapes. Historians still argue whether gaps in the archaeological record reflect loss, lack of discovery, or something more subtle. There's no full consensus. New sites continue to reshape timelines, reminding you how provisional conclusions must remain. A fringe idea proposes that an ancient civilization deliberately avoided leaving evidence in order to remain unseen. This theory is not widely accepted. Avoiding all durable traces over thousands of years would require implausible consistency. Archaeology shows that even modest societies leave patterns. The solid ground remains intact. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, the idea shifts again. What if there was nothing to hide? What if influence occurred through teaching rather than construction? No cities, no machines, no monuments, just people moving, instructing and moving on. You notice how often the story keeps returning to this theme. Creation through instruction, humans shaped by what they are taught rather than what they are built from. This version does not conflict with evolution. It exists alongside it. What's broadly accepted is that cultural transmission can change behaviour faster than biological change. Archaeology suggests that shifts in diet, tool use and social organisation can occur within a few generations. The evidence we do have points to culture as a powerful accelerator, but accelerators are hard to see once the motion stabilises. After a change becomes normal, it disappears into baseline. A careful reading might suggest that the most influential moments are often the least visible in retrospect. A popular rumour claims that advanced ancient knowledge is hidden just beyond current excavation sites. Most historians agree that while discoveries continue, the overall picture of human development is robust. Missing pieces refine the story rather than overturn it. That distinction matters. Still, the feeling of incompleteness remains. You are aware that what you know is partial. That awareness itself is part of the human story. Humans have always known that they inherited more than they understand. You think again about teaching roles. Specialists who travel lightly, advisors rather than rulers. Knowledge shared, not enforced. Such roles would leave minimal material trace, especially if they blended into existing groups. This is debated. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is a way to think about how influence might exist without artifacts, not a claim that it did. The story slows here because it must. This is the mist. Solid ground remains beneath you, but the air thickens with uncertainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You do not feel misled. You feel invited to notice limits, to respect what evidence can and cannot say, to hold wonder without urgency. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization now feels less like a statement about the past and more like a mirror held up to the present, a reflection of how much we want origins to be intentional rather than accidental, guided rather than improvised. The night remains calm. The story continues, careful and unhurried, carrying you toward its final stretch. You continue, and the story shifts into a quieter register, one that asks for restraint rather than excitement. This is the place where speculation must be handled gently, not because curiosity is wrong, but because clarity matters. What's broadly accepted is that fringe theories appear whenever evidence feels incomplete or unsettling. Archaeology suggests that uncertainty invites imagination, especially around origins. The evidence we do have points to humans filling gaps with stories long before formal explanation existed. Fringe ideas are not random. They cluster around moments of change, loss, or ambiguity. Most historians agree that when the record grows thin, alternative explanations multiply. This does not make them foolish. It makes them human. Curiosity does not wait patiently for certainty. One interpretation is that fringe theories function as thought experiments. They ask questions mainstream models cannot yet answer cleanly. A careful reading might suggest that their value lies less in truth claims and more in highlighting unresolved puzzles. You notice how often these theories return to the same themes: lost civilizations, hidden teachers, sudden leaps. A popular rumour claims that ancient humans inherited knowledge from a vanished advanced culture. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers intentionality. It replaces chance with design. Historians still argue whether fringe ideas should be dismissed outright or studied as cultural artefacts. There's no full consensus. Some scholars see them as distractions. Others see them as reflections of genuine discomfort with incomplete narratives. What's broadly accepted is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary support. Archaeology suggests that large-scale advanced societies leave unmistakable traces. Roads waste modified landscapes. The evidence we do have does not show this in deep prehistory. That boundary matters. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, fringe theories can be reframed. Instead of asking whether a hidden civilization existed, we ask why the idea feels compelling. What emotional need does it meet? You imagine early humans facing rapid change. New tools, new rules, new social structures. Explanation lags behind experience. Stories rush in to stabilize meaning. Creation narratives offer reassurance. Someone planned this. Someone guided us. A more cautious explanation could be that humans are uncomfortable with randomness at scale. Where many changes occur together, intention feels more satisfying than coincidence. Myth becomes a psychological anchor. What's broadly accepted is that humans anthropomorphize forces they cannot predict. Archaeology suggests that early belief systems often reflect attempts to negotiate uncertainty. The evidence we do have points to narrative as a coping strategy, but coping strategies can still preserve fragments of reality. A careful reading might suggest that fringe ideas sometimes exaggerate real phenomena: cultural acceleration, knowledge transfer, uneven expertise. These are documented. Their framing as creation is interpretive. You notice how the story keeps correcting itself gently, not because curiosity is dangerous, but because clarity protects trust. This channel does not offer hidden truths. It offers careful walking. A fringe idea proposes that humans were biologically engineered by an ancient civilization. This theory is not widely accepted. Genetic evidence shows continuity with earlier hominins. The solid ground here is firm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea shifts away from biology entirely. It becomes metaphorical. Humans created as social beings through instruction, ritual, and shared meaning. That reframing matters. It keeps speculation within safe bounds. It allows wonder without misleading. You feel the tone settle again. The excitement softens into reflection. We are not rejecting imagination. We are placing it where it belongs, alongside evidence, not above it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You move on, carrying not answers, but a better sense of how to ask questions without rushing them. That too is a form of instruction. The night remains calm. The path continues. You continue, and the story settles into uncertainty without discomfort. This is not the edge of confusion, but the centre of honest inquiry. What's broadly accepted is that many questions about early human development remain open, not because evidence is hidden, but because time erases detail. Archaeology suggests that even well-studied periods hold contradictions. The evidence we do have points to a past that is partially visible and partially unreachable. You notice how scholars speak carefully when certainty thins. Language softens, verbs lean toward might and could. Most historians agree that this caution is not weakness, it is respect for complexity. The past is not a single thread. It is a braid of environment, behaviour, chance, and memory. One interpretation is that debates themselves are part of the story. A careful reading might suggest that disagreement reflects the limits of method rather than failure of understanding. When data fragments, interpretation must step in, but only gently. Historians still argue whether sudden cultural shifts represent internal tipping points or external influence. There's no full consensus, and that absence of closure matters. It keeps the story open rather than fixed. You imagine scholars spread across disciplines. Archaeologists examine soil, geneticists examine code, anthropologists examine story. Each sees a different layer. None see the whole. What's broadly accepted is that no single field can answer origin questions alone. Archaeology suggests that synthesis is necessary, but synthesis always carries interpretation. A fringe idea proposes that unresolved debates point toward suppressed truths. This theory is not widely accepted. Academic disagreement is visible, public, and often encouraged. The solid ground here is transparency rather than secrecy. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though the idea shifts again. What if unresolved questions persist because the past does not resolve neatly? What if ambiguity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a condition to be respected? You feel how the story has changed you slightly. At the beginning, the question sounded dramatic. What if humans were created by an ancient civilization felt like a challenge? Now it feels more like a meditation on how humans understand beginnings at all. What's broadly accepted is that humans search for intention in origin stories. Archaeology suggests that when processes are long and impersonal, people reshape them into narratives with agents. The evidence we do have points to storytelling as a bridge between experience and meaning. A popular rumour claims that consensus is avoided because it would collapse mystery. Most historians agree the opposite is true. Scholars pursue clarity relentlessly even when it dissolves wonder. Wonder survives anyway. You let yourself sit inside the debate rather than above it. Scholars continue to debate because the questions are real, not because answers are forbidden, but because evidence speaks softly. A careful reading might suggest that the most responsible position is not belief or disbelief, but attentiveness, listening to what the past allows us to hear without demanding it say more. You move forward not toward resolution, but toward perspective. The story has not promised answers. It has offered a way of holding questions without tension. The night remains calm. The path continues towards its final stretch. You continue, and the story begins to feel closer to home, less distant in time, more reflective in tone. This is where the question turns inward rather than outward. What's broadly accepted is that humans learn, adapt, and organise themselves through social instruction. Archaeology suggests that cooperation, imitation, and teaching are among the most powerful forces shaping behaviour. The evidence we do have points to culture as something built between people, not inherited, fully formed. You notice how often learning feels transformative. A child does not simply gain information, they become someone new through it. Skills reshape identity, rules reshape relationships. Most historians agree that the difference between survival and society is instruction. Without shared learning, groups fragment. With it, they persist. One interpretation is that creation myths speak to this transformation rather than biological origin. A careful reading might suggest that to be created means to be shaped into a member of a system. someone who knows how to live within rules, rhythms, and expectations. You imagine a moment of teaching that changes everything. Not dramatic, quiet. Someone explains a better way to resolve conflict. Someone demonstrates a new pattern for sharing food. Someone teaches how to coordinate labour. Afterward, life feels different, more predictable, more stable. To those who experience it, this feels like becoming human in a fuller sense. Historians still argue whether early social complexity emerged primarily from necessity or from innovation. There's no full consensus. Some evidence suggests pressure drove cooperation. Other evidence points to experimentation and choice. Both likely played roles. A fringe idea proposes that humans were intentionally designed as students by an ancient civilization. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology shows that humans are capable learners without external designers. The solid ground here is clear. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however the idea transforms, what if humans were not created by an ancient civilization, but created as a civilization through teaching? What if instruction itself is the act of creation? You feel how this reframing softens the question. It no longer demands lost technologies or hidden masters. It asks you to consider how much of what you are came from people you never met. Teachers, elders, storytellers, rule keepers. Their influence shaped your behaviour as surely as any physical design. What's broadly accepted is that humans are deeply imitative. Archaeology suggests that learning spreads rapidly when models are visible and trusted. The evidence we do have points to teaching as a multiplier of change. But teaching requires time and attention. Not everyone does it equally. Those who do become central nodes in social networks. Over generations, memory elevates their role. A careful reading might suggest that creators in myth are remembered teachers whose influence outlived their names. A popular rumour claims that ancient texts explicitly describe humans as engineered students. Most historians agree that such readings project modern concepts onto ancient language. Terms like making and shaping often refer to social formation rather than physical construction. That distinction matters. Still, the metaphor holds emotional power. Humans as students implies intention. It implies guidance. It implies that learning itself is sacred. In many cultures, knowledge is treated with reverence precisely because it creates order. You think about how societies mark education. Initiation rites, coming-of-age ceremonies, tests. These are moments of symbolic creation. A person enters as one thing and emerges as another. Creation language appears naturally here without implying biology. Archaeology suggests that such rites appear early and persist widely. The evidence we do have points to learning being ritualized because it matters. It changes who belongs and who does not. Historians still argue whether these rituals evolved independently or spread through contact. There's no full consensus. What is clear is their persistence. Humans everywhere mark the moment of becoming. You let the idea settle. Creation is becoming. Humans, not made once, but repeatedly through instruction and participation. In that light, the idea of an ancient civilization creating humans feels less literal and more symbolic, a way of honouring the power of teaching to transform lives. This is debated. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is one way to interpret why creation language appears so often around knowledge and rules. The story grows gentler here. You are not being led to a revelation, you are being invited to notice continuity, from early camps to modern classrooms, from firelight instruction to written law. Humans are shaped by those who teach them how to live together. The night remains calm. The question no longer presses. It rests beside you, familiar and softened as you move toward the final stretch. You continue, and the story begins to thin, not because it is running out, but because it no longer needs density. The question has changed shape so many times that it now feels familiar, almost gentle. What's broadly accepted is that human identity is not fixed at birth, but formed through participation in culture. Archaeology suggests that belonging, learning, and shared practice define who counts as human within a group. The evidence we do have points to humanity as something performed and reinforced, not merely inherited. You notice how often societies define people by what they know rather than what they are. Initiation marks the moment someone is trusted with knowledge. Language marks who belongs. Customs mark insiders and outsiders. Most historians agree that these boundaries are cultural creations, not biological ones. They can shift, expand, or contract across time. One interpretation is that creation stories describe this moment of inclusion. A careful reading might suggest that being created means being recognized. Someone is taught the rules, the stories, the rhythms. After that, they are fully human in the eyes of the group. You imagine standing at the edge of a circle. You know how to survive, but you do not yet know how to belong. Then someone speaks. Someone shows you how things are done here. Afterward, your status changes. That transition carries weight. It deserves a story. Historians still argue whether identity in early societies was primarily kin-based or skill-based. There's no full consensus. Some groups emphasized bloodlines, others emphasized participation. Both models appear in the record sometimes side by side. A fringe idea proposes that early humans were created to serve or learn from a higher civilization. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology does not support a master-student hierarchy spanning species or eras. The solid ground remains that humans organize themselves according to local needs and values. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, the idea becomes symbolic again. Humans created as roles rather than organisms. Students created through instruction. Citizens created through law. Believers created through ritual. You notice how often modern life still works this way. You are not born knowing how to navigate institutions. You are taught. You are not born into professional identity. You learn it. Creation continues quietly without ceremony every time instruction reshapes behaviour. What's broadly accepted is that culture can feel as powerful as nature. Archaeology suggests that social rules can override instinct. The evidence we do have points to humans modifying themselves continuously through learning. But memory still prefers beginnings. It prefers first moments. It prefers someone starting it all. A careful reading might suggest that this preference reflects cognitive ease rather than historical accuracy. Stories need anchors. A popular rumour claims that ancient texts secretly reveal a literal creation of humans by advanced beings. Most historians agree that such readings often strip texts of metaphor and context. Ancient language is dense with symbolism. That distinction matters. Still, symbolism does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. Creation myths endure because they speak to something that keeps happening. Humans keep becoming something new through contact instruction and shared meaning. You feel the tone settling into reassurance. The question no longer threatens to overturn what you know. It complements it. It asks you to see humanity as an ongoing process rather than a finished object. Archaeology suggests that cultures continually redefine what it means to be human. The evidence we do have points to flexibility as a survival trait. Fixed definitions fracture under pressure. Adaptable ones endure. So the idea that humans were created by an ancient civilization can be understood as a reflection of this adaptability. Not a claim about hidden engineers, but a recognition that instruction shapes destiny. Whoever teaches controls the future, not through force but through framing. This is debated. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is one way humans have expressed the power of knowledge over time. You feel the story preparing to close, not with an answer but with balance. Solid ground beneath your feet. Mist at the edges, curiosity intact. The night remains calm. The question rests easily, now no longer demanding resolution, only reflection. You arrive without a clear sense of arrival. The story does not signal an ending, because endings were never its purpose. It simply widens and softens as if it knows you have carried the question far enough. What's broadly accepted is that no single explanation accounts for how humans became what they are. Archaeology suggests a layered process shaped by biology, environment, learning, and memory. The evidence we do have points to humanity as something continuously assembled rather than once completed. You look back over the path you have walked. Tools, fire, stories, fields, sky knowledge, writing, law, teaching. None of these require a hidden ancient civilization to exist. Humans are capable of all of them. Most historians agree that human creativity, cooperation, and adaptability are sufficient explanations for the rise of culture, and yet the question never asked to replace that ground. One interpretation is that the idea of humans being created by an ancient civilization is not about denying human agency. A careful reading might suggest it is about honouring influence, about recognising how deeply we are shaped by those who came before us and taught us how to live. Historians still argue whether origin stories should be read as literal history or symbolic memory. There's no full consensus, and perhaps there never will be. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is an invitation to humility. A fringe idea proposes that humans were deliberately designed or guided by a vanished advanced society. This theory is not widely accepted. Archaeology and genetics do not support biological engineering or global ancient mastery. The solid ground remains firm, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. However, the idea becomes something gentler. Humans created not in bodies, but in behaviour, created as farmers, builders, citizens, storytellers, created again each time knowledge passes from one generation to the next. What's broadly accepted is that learning transforms identity. Archaeology suggests that instruction can reshape societies faster than any physical change. The evidence we do have points to teaching as one of the most powerful forces in human history. So perhaps the ancient civilization was never a separate group at all. Perhaps it was humanity itself, at an earlier stage, teaching itself how to become something more stable, more coordinated, more symbolic. A careful reading might suggest that when humans speak of creators, they are speaking about moments when understanding arrived faster than memory could explain. You do not need to decide anything. This story was never asking for belief. It was offering perspective. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We kept the solid ground separate from the mist. You feel the pace slow now, sentences stretch, the urgency fades. You picture the same quiet fire from the beginning, hands past tools, voices past stories, knowledge moves forward one calm exchange at a time. No grand design, no final testimony, just continuity. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. And that is not a problem to solve. It is a space to rest within. Take a slow breath. Let the question loosen its grip. You have followed it far enough for tonight. The story does not end. It simply grows quiet around you. Wind down, now everything slows. The edges of the story soften until they no longer ask for attention. The questions that once felt sharp become round and distant like stones worn smooth by water. You're not carrying a theory to bed. You are carrying a feeling, a sense of continuity. You remember that humans have always lived this way, between knowing and wondering, between evidence and imagination. Archaeology gives us ground. Stories give us shelter. Neither needs to defeat the other. They work best when they share the space. The idea that humans were created by an ancient civilization no longer feels dramatic. It feels calm. It feels like a way of saying that learning matters, that being taught matters, that no one becomes human alone. You think of all the hands you never saw, all the voices you never heard, all the instructions that shaped you quietly. This is not mystery as spectacle. This is mystery as gratitude. Your breathing steadies, the mind stops reaching outward. The story settles where it belongs, not as an answer, but as a companion. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to resolve, only rest.